Hey Michael, how you doing, man?
Hey, doing great. Crazy week, right?
Yeah, heck of a week. So just want to jump on, talk about it a bit. So I'll start with I was just mentioning before we started recording, I was with some buddies last night from guys I know from college, and we were just having a great time out for one of my friends' birthdays, and then driving home, I was talking to one of my real good friends, and we're chatting about AI. Like we hadn't talked about it all night, but AI came up, and he goes, hey, I was chatting with my brother, and remember back in 2015, 2016, self-driving cars had all this hype, and then it kind of didn't pan out. Like, where are they? AI might be the same thing. All this chatter, all this hype might be sitting here 7, 8 years from now. Hey, where was it all? Right? What happened? But he's not keeping up with the day to day of it. So I said, hey, man, I disagree. First of all, there are self driving cars in San Francisco, and I just saw my first self driving car without driver, a Waymo, here in Santa Monica the other day. It was a real big moment. But the biggest thing is I just walked him through all the changes that happened just in the last week. So I'll just, from my view, summarize them, and then I want to hear your thoughts as to what I'm missing or your reaction to these. But from my view, it's the first thing is that obviously GPT, this tremendous set of updates this week where it basically gained the ability to see, gain vision,
Mhm.
right? I took a picture of a plant yesterday, a bunch of different succulents like by this apartment near my house, and I just said, what are these 3 words? And it gave a full list describing all the different plants. I have a sweatshirt that says Lehman Brothers. I think it's very funny. I have this very particular sense of humor. I took a selfie and said, why might this sweatshirt be ironic? And it gave a full explanation of why wearing a Lehman Brothers sweatshirt is ironic. Like, what? So that's just one. On top of that, I know GPT can now has voice ability. I believe it can scan the internet. Although the one I have right now, it's still just through January 22. But on top of that, a couple of others, and I want to hear your reaction. Lex Friedman comes out with this podcast, first ever podcast in the metaverse. So it's him and Zuck talking with completely photorealistic images in this metaverse. Felt like a huge moment. It was really going around Twitter. And then the other one that was huge was just this Hey Gen. There's been a lot of chatter on Twitter, and I saw one guy doing it with Russian where he was speaking English and then he's speaking Russian. But then this other guy had a thread of like 10 different languages, including Mandarin, by the way, which I religiously study. He's just doing my Chinese, before I hopped on here. And it's changing, taking his English, his a minute of English, and not only translating it, but in his voice, and AI is moving his mouth to sound like he's speaking these languages. And he lists Hindi, Dutch, French, German, Mandarin. So just a slew of changes. I'm sure there's others too, but those were, as far as I can tell, just in the last week. So yeah, man, I just want your thoughts, and it's a bit disorienting, very exciting, exhilarating. What do you think?
Yeah, dude, I had that same reaction where I was with family last night and I was like bringing up all this stuff. And one, they never even like heard about it. So they're not even hyped into the news.
Totally.
And then when you like bring up what's coming out, there's kind of this like dismissive laugh. It's like, oh, that's crazy. Like
Yeah.
that's insane. That's never gonna happen. Um, and I was just reading that post from Venkatesh Rao, where it's like you have this competition of narratives, and it's almost like a narrative is both kind of like you have to measure its popularity and its consequentiality, like how much of an impact will it have? And like talk about Galileo, like at the time that was like even though it was true and it eventually became real, it was so unpopular for 100 years that it just kind of like was dismissed.
Yeah.
You could say the same thing with computers, like in the 80s, early 80s, right? It was like even back to 78, it was like a nerdy thing that was like laughed at. And it wasn't until like 83, the
Mm.
computer was Time Machine's Man of the Year. It was the computer. And like from that point on, it became like, oh, this is like actually consequential. And
Mm.
so like we're in this state where like AR, crypto, and VR, it's all in that narrative of like, oh, I'm kind of scared of this. This is so radical, I can't even conceive it. And so it's laughed at
Yeah.
until there's that point where it like becomes real and useful. And we're like right on the cusp of this stuff being extremely real, and something that the average person wants. And so, like, if you think about like Meta's keynote, which was on Tuesday,
That
there
all
was like,
happened this week, by the way. Wild. Yeah.
yeah, it had like three sections, right? It was kind of like it have the Quest Pro, sorry, the Quest 3, and that's what they were. That's kind of like what Lex and Mark were doing. Then it had AI, and then it had the glasses, right? And like eventually all that stuff is going to fuse into glasses like these, right? And dude, just the ability to be able to have real-time translation, right? Like people might start getting these glasses now, not for the VR or the AR, just for the fact to have like, I can use these like visual jam. I can look at a building, it'll tell me what it is. I can go to Greece and I can communicate in my motherland with the people there. Like it's going to become so obvious to have these things eventually that 100% of people will be wearing smart glasses, you know?
Well, contacts, right? Eventually, probably contacts.
Eventually, yeah.
Maybe, maybe not for a few years, but yeah.
There's a thing though, because like one of the reasons why I think, especially when you tell people virtual contacts, they just like freak out because like the eye is so like sensitive. Like some of them like touching their eyes, and even like with a headset, the idea of blocking your vision, it's like there's this symbolic like fear of like, oh, I'm going to be deceived if I'm blind. I'm shown an illusion, and so it's like that's kind of a frontier that's going to be hard to cross. But it's like eventually it's going to be so appealing that people will just get over it.
Yeah. And I think the Ray-Bans is so interesting because it's funny, by the way, because I remember in January of this year, you had Ray-Ban. I mean, I think it's the ones you're wearing now. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And were those from Meta?
They are, yeah. This is the first kind of generation.
But they sort of like went real public with it this week. But yeah, I remember even you having them earlier this year and you being able to record. Right, you're playing ping pong and you're recording little snippets and documenting your day. And there is something really, yeah, it's more acceptable to be, like you said, this clear thing. It's so much more subtle than like the Apple Vision ones or like this really oppressive VR ones. But so yeah, it'll just be interesting to see what consumers really pick up on and like what really catches. Right. It's funny because like Google and Snapchat tried this stuff like say 5-6 years ago, it's too early. And then on one hand, you have this really clunky Apple one. And did the Facebook one, was it really clunky? Did they have a clunky version too, and the Ray-Bans, or just the Ray-Bans?
A clunky version of what?
VR, like a because you're saying like the big VR thing that just like covers your eyes. I guess they do, right? Because that's what Zuck was.
Yeah. It was this thing, right? It's the Quest. So they have like the big form factor and the small factor, and they're continuously trying to cram as much as they can into this. And the Quest 3 will be 500, Vision Pro is 3,500, and that's like the upper end. And then there's the lower end, which is 200 to 300, and like over 15 years, they'll converge into being the same thing.
Got it. The thing that, yeah, man, the thing that just hits me is with all, if that all happened in 1 week, and then you can just, like I sent you that video of Bezos talking about the washing machine was invented in 1908, and electricity comes out, and like people don't quite know what to do with it. It seems it's really dangerous. Like the idea of like putting this thing that can kill anybody in everybody's walls would probably seem as preposterously risky. And then I think his point with that speech was there was like they didn't even have like the wall socket, and then that gets invented. And they're like, oh man, we can really use this thing. And then these different like appliances come along. And they're seen as amazing, right? This washing machine in 1908. And it's basically like these wooden buckets with like, I don't even know what exactly rigged up. And then now what we have, of course, is just like, so, I mean, the most sophisticated washing machine versus like that, obviously just night and day. That level of development, but then compressed into probably like 1/10, 1/20th the time frame. It's extremely exciting, but even to you and I don't know, I mean, certainly I feel it's destabilizing, disorienting. And we're leaning into it and really excited about the stuff. We're creating texts all week about this. So how do you, how does the average person deal with any of this? Because my family sort of has similar reactions when I tell them about it. And I don't say everything, but I'll send a quick, screenshot of GPT, understanding the sarcasm in my sweatshirt, or this Lehman Brothers sweatshirt yesterday. Like, I just don't know like how the average person's gonna assimilate to all this, or if they will. And once you assimilate, you're already on to the next thing anyways.
Right. And I think at a certain point, like when you hit a certain age, there's a limit to how much you can assimilate. And it's really only the young that are gonna catch on to it. And I think this is kind of, I think, a big reason why like Facebook rebranded to Meta. Like I think in 15 years, you're gonna have a whole generation of people who are born today, and they're going to be just living in a world by Meta, and like they're going to have no knowledge of Facebook or Cambridge Analytica. There's all these privacy scandals in the 80s and 90s that we know nothing about, but at the time, like it was a crisis. So I really think like if you go into Meta's, I was just in there on Wednesday. I went to the keynote in virtual reality, and you're going to this it was kind of, there's a lot of friction to get in, but once you're there, they've gamified the whole thing. So it's like you go in and it's like, oh, I can collect badges and there's challenges. And so it's like they're trying to build this kind of video game thing that appeals to younger generations. And like that's, to me, I'm like, why would I ever want to do that? Like I'm already aged out of that kind of thing, you know? But
That feels
yeah.
well, it's funny to it's so hard to see the world in these long time horizons. I attempt to do it. And like when I think about a lot, like my personal life, I think like I just turned 30. I've been thinking a lot about where I want to be by 40. And I love this quote. Sam Hinkie, this basketball general manager, says, the long view picks at the lock of mediocrity. So I very much try, whether it's what's happening with rite of passage, my Chinese, when I think about, you know, my reading, my writing, where that's all leading, I do really try to think in these longer time horizons because I think it can give you a big advantage. And all the great leaders, Bezos famously thinks in these long time scales, whatever. But with other things, it's hard to do that because we're not wired to think in 10-year time horizons whatsoever. And so when Facebook revamped to Meta, everybody's cracking jokes, how ridiculous it sounds. Oh, it's just spin. But if you zoom out and view it on the 10, 15, 20-year time horizons, it's like, think about Apple. I don't know when Apple was founded. It was the mid 70s probably. And so you picture like Apple in the late 80s, 1989, 1990, somewhere like that. That's probably like the equivalent time scale of where Facebook was when it rebranded to Meta. And like to us, like Apple in 1989 or 1990 is nothing. Like they're just kicking rocks. They're just getting started. And yet like you could choose to view Facebook on the same time horizon. So imagine Facebook's equivalent of say 2005, which is still super early Apple. They didn't even have the iPhone yet. Like that's 2038. That means the iPhone comes out in 2040. Like, do you see what I'm saying? Like you can just shift these time horizons and suddenly, yeah, there's gonna be people who are born now who are like, you know, in 2040 are just coming of age, so to speak, to like as adults and stuff. And they, yeah, like you said, they'll have no knowledge of Facebook. They're the same way I know nothing about like whatever they were, the Apple II, like all those old Apple computers from the 80s. I don't know anything about them, and I don't care because I wasn't around for those. And so that's first time I've thought about the Meta rebrand at that time horizon. And I think Zuck is the type of person who has the ability to think in those time scales. And yeah, it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's something that I've been trying to do is to get a slightly more accurate sense of the future. Because I think like your first notion is like, oh, we're just on this exponential runaway train and we have no ability to know what's in the future. But like when you run a company that is thinking 10 and 20 years, like you need some sort of model, some way, like some loose framework that you can make decisions within. And so I've been like really interested in these cyclical theories of time. Like the Strauss-Howe generational theory looks back to the 1600s and they say we're in this 80-year loop defined by the average human lifespan. And without realizing it, there's just this human nature. There's this thing that's happening over and over with cycles. And I was trying to just like zoom in and say like, okay, if the internet started or computing started in the early 60s, are we in a similar cycle? And at least this is just like a version one of like a framework I'm trying to make, but you can see from starting in 62 to 92 and then now in 2022, there's a 30-year loop where it's like you have some new invention, you have a bunch of visionaries kind of showing what's possible. I don't know if you saw Doug Engelbart in 1968. There's this thing called the mother of all demos. He has a personal computer, and in 68, he's showing a demo with the computer mouse of like spreadsheets and Notion and like, here's what the future is going to be. And it was 1968. And it doesn't come true until then, like 15 years later. But it's like, it's a really early prophecy.
Oh, even 15 years later, though, like this is the thing about the future being unevenly distributed. Like 83, yeah, it was there, but like I mean, it really is. I would argue another 15 years, 1998, and then it has like reasonably widespread adoption in like offices and stuff, but then into people's actual lives, like even probably another 10 years. So it's like in some ways, 5 years after that demo. No, sorry, more than, I mean, whatever, 25 years after the time frame you just gave, like 83 to say, yeah, the early mid 2000s when it's really truly baked into like all society. So
yeah. And it's like, so basically just to go through it quick, is you have vision and then you have control, where some companies figure out how to control that technology. And through that control, they bring in new means of access.
Hmm.
Right? So that access was first the personal computer and then the iPhone. It will eventually be VR, and I think that's what Meta and Apple both see, that that's the next wave that's coming around. And then after that, it's kind of like division, where it's like that medium has reached its full potential, and we're experiencing some crisis. Like we've seen the ramifications of that thing, and we can't agree on what to do. We
Hmm.
don't really solve it, and then a new cycle starts where AI comes out.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, so it's fascinating. My question. So you have this, yeah, I love the chart. You sent me some of the charts. I know you've got articles on this, just like this cyclical thing of 30 years, but isn't there this thing of just exponential acceleration? And so does that whole cycle begin to compress? Because, there's obviously ways to look at, like, this thinker I really like, Jordan Hall, has the theory of the blue church and how much basically bandwidth society has for like information. And there's sort of like the Victorian age, which is, say, basically like most of the 19th century up until, say, the early 20th century, maybe until the invention of the radio or something. And then that's like 100-year block. And then it comes down to 50 years of, like, the 20th century, like just absolute mass media. And then maybe the next block kind of compresses to 25 years. And so there's this doubling of how quickly you shift from like one information paradigm to the next. So then you say, well, then, okay, the next one's, 12 and a half years, and the next one's 6 years and 3. And so on one hand, you have the cyclical thing. On the other hand, you have this acceleration. So how do you square those two?
Yeah, so I think it's actually figuring out that both those patterns are happening at the same time. So in like from 65, when Moore's law came out, it was about the exponential rise in computing power. And if you think about the early 90s, it was the exponential rise in websites, right? And like the nature of what was online. And then now we're actually going through the same thing with intelligence. There's always some characteristic that just like explodes. But I think the cyclical nature more has to do with like human nature and institutions. Right? So in Strauss Howe, it's like you can go back to the 30 Years' War or the Civil War or like nukes in World War II. And it's, even though the technology is radically different, it's the same kind of humans that are going through these dilemmas. And maybe you could even say that, like, at the scale of the internet, there's just a certain kind of behavioral cycle of companies that we happen to work in these 7.5-year intervals. But like that said, I think if you just compare a clunky computer in 82 to an iPhone, that's a radical difference. And then from an iPhone to what the Vision Pro will be in 2037, that is going to, like, it's unimaginable what that's going to be.
So you're saying it's almost like this biological hardware that we have, which is, essentially the same as like the 30 Years' War or whatever, maybe like some change, but largely the same. And so then that is like a rate limiter to, like, you just keep turning this cyclical thing. And what were the three you said? Moore's law, would that be processing power? And then what? Processing, computing, you're distinguishing those two, and then intelligence would be this one.
Sorry, it was like kind of processing, computing, or kind of from the 60s onward.
Yeah.
And it's really the miniaturization of things. And then in the 90s, it was websites. Like if you look at the graph of websites in the 90s, it's relatively consistent. And then like 97, 98, we've just been on a tear since then.
So basically processing internet intelligence, to say it really.
Right. And so now we're at the point where we're calculating like how many synapses does the LLM have? And like, oh, we're currently at like rodent level, like a rodent powered brain. And by 29, it's going to be equivalent to a human powered brain.
Well, it's a rodent that can understand the irony of a Lehman Brothers sweatshirt. So. No, but Sam Altman had a tweet in February of this year, so I just saw it resurface this week, of like, maybe we have a new Moore's law for intelligence. It's doubling every 18 months. But that is so, because the implications of processing doubling every 18 months, like, took like many, many years to bear out. Like the fact that Moore's law started in the 60s, like your life, say, is like 73 and you get another 18 months, it's like fall of 75. It didn't affect your life at all, like at all, unless you're in like a very niche sort of leading edge thing. Mm-hmm. The doubling of, the website exponential curve that takes off in the 90s, it starts, in fact, that again impact the average person's life. I just think it's somewhere in the mid 2000s. And you go a bit earlier, a bit later. Certainly the social media stuff start kicking in the late 2000s, then it really starts affecting everyone's life. But this intelligence thing, it's just the ramifications are going to hit so much more quickly, I really think, right? So if it's doubling every 18 months, just 5 years from now, let alone sort of the 15, 20, 38, 15 years out from now. I just, here's a specific example, get really concrete. This guy, McKay Wrigley, I texted you about him. He was a kid on Twitter a few years ago, like 3,000 followers. And now he has like 100,000 followers. And he's just going off about advancements of AI. It's great stuff. And he had a really viral tweet this week where he just screenshotted an image of a cell that'd be from like a biology textbook. And it had like 20 labels, a Golgi body, endoplasmic reticulum, whatever, all these little parts of a cell. And he just goes GPT with the image capability, says, hey, I don't get this. I'm a 9th grade biology student. Explain this to me. Obviously, just incredible explanation. And then he can just go from there and ask about each individual component of the cell. So just taking the lens of education, right? Like that just, if we stop right here with GPT being able to recognize images, I mean, all of education, it would take so many years for the implications of that to play out.
Right.
Schools, oh my goodness, can you imagine the school districts with their biology calls it the paperware of like, I'm just imagining like a school district in Missouri or whatever, like trying to like work through these changes, or colleges or whatever. But then just when they're like a few years from now trying to wrap their heads around this and understand it, and the unions are trying to push back, but that's already been left in the dust, and it's twice as intelligent. And now you can have a dialogue. I mean, you probably already do this, but like a dialogue with it, like where it can be quizzing you about the components of a set. It just keeps going and going. Like there's such inertia behind people's view of the world. Like we always talk about the right passages, the go for it window, but also this inertia, institutional inertia. And like, it's just like a wave that just tumbles all these systems, and then they finally catch a breath, and then they're just getting tumbled by an even bigger wave. And it's just like, what is this gonna do? Like, it's such a like vague question, because I don't really know, other than it's very it's gonna have huge changes, but I have no idea what that's gonna look like. How do you think about that?
Yeah, I think there's like two paths. Because like, so you have this takeaway intelligence, but even with where we are now, it's not just how do schools adopt it. It's like we haven't actually figured out the right interfaces to have people engage with it. Like, how do you actually build a whole custom interface or a product for a 7-year-old to go through 3rd grade with AI? Like, that's still a huge challenge. That has nothing to do with our intelligence. It's more like user testing and product building. And it might take 5 years to figure that out.
Right. Right.
And so it's like, you're going to have this, the intelligence and then the applications of it lagging, but the real kind of like wrench in everything, which might even disrupt this whole cycle that we've been in, is just the nature of like what happens when you have like this insanely powerful intelligence. And right now we're like kind of breeding this intelligence ourselves, as in like they made GPT-4, and 6 months, it took 6 months to parent it, to actually train it right from wrong and make it like safe for the public. But like it's really going to change, I think, when you have like really powerful open source language models, and eventually you can design it so that it takes new data, like new outputs, and it trains that, and it refines its language model in real time. And we actually don't even know the pace. Like, we think we're going exponential. What we think might play out in 6 years, if it can recursively learn, it might happen in 6 days, for all we know, if it has all the power.
Well, so this is really interesting, because it is still largely governed by OpenAI's decision. Now there are exceptions. Didn't Facebook have some LLM and it got out, and it's just like kicking around torrenting sites and whatever, like, but I think there have at least some that have like, there have been some LLMs that have gotten out and people are like using them. So somewhere there's stuff like running on like local hardware and like not being governed by some,
Yeah. And it's the same difference between like this and this, you know what I mean? Like, this is ChatGPT and this is like open source, but eventually the little glasses and the open source LLMs will become as powerful as the GPT-4 is today. And then you're going to have some random 15-year-old who will say like, hey, I'm going to parent this thing and I want $1 billion. And can you do whatever it takes to get me $1 billion? And like, these things are basically amoral, and they're just going to be following the code of how it's programmed.
And they're not going to have like what is it, right? RHLF or whatever. Like, that's only when it's governed by the. Okay, so here's an interesting example of this. Yesterday, I like sent this to my family. Again, like, I'm not even sure if I should send it to them, because it's like, if you think about all this in together, it can be sort of destabilizing. But I just sent him 2 screenshots of GPT explaining the plants near my apartment and understanding my Lehman Brothers sweatshirt. And there's just like, my mom was like, wait, what's going on here? So I've sort of explained it a bit more. She thought it was interesting. And then my dad was like, well, I hope it can't do that for faces. And I said, well, it can't. It can only do for objects. And my aunt liked that message that I sent. And so like, it's a natural thing to worry about. Like, how horrific would that be if you could go to like people, you know, people are like already tweeting like pics of like strangers that they take on the street. You like take a picture of the stranger, be like, how attractive is this person? Like what's that word? Physiognomy. I can never say that word, but you know what I'm talking about, like the way the face looks. Can you interpret that? And yeah, it's like it can't do that right now, but of course, in absolute terms, of course, it's capable of doing that. It's just that OpenAI isn't letting it do that. But
right. You can do it with your lock screen with an iPhone.
What's that?
With your iPhone and a lock screen, it can detect your face. Like that same technology could be built into glasses.
Of course, it could be here tomorrow if they wanted. Now they're governing it and they're not letting it out, but it'll get out. It's like, yeah, it's sort of like if you want to go like the Prometheus fire route, it's like this contained thing, but there's like sparks kicking out, and some of them are going to catch, and then it'll just go. And I mean, so many different. You can talk about education, and obvious one is politics and the election. Like obviously, 2024 will be interesting. You know, how much will the fake videos play a role? How much will sort of very hyper specified like targeted ads or content play a role based on AI like that? You know, just infinite floods of information. And like 2024, it'll be one thing. It's already pretty shaky from 16 in 2020. And then we'll see how it plays out in 24. And then it just keeps coming, 28, 32. Like, it just seems like these institutions are already stretched to the gills with the existing information abundance we have. And once you add this to the mix, that seems really destabilizing. So I'm trying to think of like because I tend to get very animated about new technologies. When Clubhouse came out 2 years ago, I was like, this is going to be change everything. Yeah. This is the new, social media platform, spatial audio, or not spatial audio, but like real-time audio. And it obviously was a total dud. Twitter Spaces is a super niche thing. Clubhouse is dead. But like, what is the like pessimist case? Like kind of my friend's brother's case of like, they hear this conversation like, oh, this is all overhyped. This is like, it doesn't seem like it is, just for the reasons we're describing. And
I think they're different. I think like Clubhouse is a software kind of breakthrough, just a slight incremental change in tech. And it's like, hey, we're going to try and create a new social network. But when you're talking about AI, crypto, and VR, those are like whole like new paradigms in how we shape institutions and our currencies and how we communicate and how we like even think, you know.
Is there a bear case? I'm sure there's one to be made, but like, what's the, just hitting the AC here, what is the bear case for all this stuff that we're talking about? Like, what is, somebody comes in here, listens to this, and it's equivalent of that guy who loves gold instead of Bitcoin. Like, what would somebody say if they're like, oh, this is overblown? It's somebody in the know, not somebody who just doesn't even know about AI, but like, can you think of one?
Yeah, I think like, I don't think there is a case where there's not crypto and there's not VR and there's not AI. Like, I think they've kind of been unlocked.
Right.
I think the bear case is if they turn into the bastardized versions of what the visionaries that they hope they'll become. That's like, exactly what happened with social media.
LinkedIn, Reid Hoffman, right?
Oh, LinkedIn story, exactly. That's a great story.
You shove it through the capitalist system and it just becomes this job market, people shouting about their accomplishment. Yeah, it's just kind of nasty place. Yeah.
And like basically, I think that virtual reality and augmented reality have this profound ability to eliminate distance, where you can effectively teleport and be with family across the world. That's the bull case. The bear case is you have Facebook take over and they're mining every single thing you see. And based on what you look at, they're giving you ads, and you're seeing ads in your home. Like that's the dystopia. So I feel like the bear case isn't that it's not going to happen; it's that the hellish version will manifest.
Yeah.
Crypto, the bull case is that we actually have a decentralized currency where there's no corruption or inflation, and anyone in the world can participate financially. The bear case is like, or dystopia is a world coin where you actually have a single power who still controls the supply. And now, since everything's digital, they have real-time transparency in all of the money in the world, and like it's just total a surveillance nightmare. And then with AI, bull case is you have access to infinite power. Any idea you have can be executed immediately. It's a post-work society. And then bear case is just an AGI. We have effectively a tyrannical force that
I mean,
there's a lot of different bear cases.
The bear case is sort of infinite. Like it could get really bad. I mean, I think everybody at least acknowledges that. I don't know. It's so hard to. Somebody on our team had a friend who she was over in Bali recently, and she had a friend who like is like a tech guy in Bali, and just told her this summer, like in May or something, that he thinks it's all over in about 3 years, and he's just trying to live in the present and be with his friends and travel. So, I mean, that's the most probably extreme bear case or Eli Yudkowsky type of thing. But
there's like there's a funny spectrum in like a cynicism where it goes from like, oh, it's never gonna happen, to like, and that's like the technology doesn't work. And then there's like, oh, it works and it's supremely evil and it's the end of the world. Right. And then there's the middle ground cynicism where it exists, it destabilizes one order and a new order forms that has some profoundly weird consequence. And so I have this like short story in the works where, I don't know when this happens, but it's a form of AGI, and it effectively takes over, and it becomes, it's a kind of a satire, but it becomes the tyrannical ruler of the world. It's a dictator, but it's a friendly dictator. And the whole idea is, as long as you listen to it, if you do everything it says, your life gets better in every dimension. And not in a fake way, but in like a very like your job gets better, you make more money, you're happier, you're more evolved. And so it's like you're sacrificing all of your free will and autonomy, and you're getting a better life from this thing that has supreme intelligence. And so it's just this weird new paradigm where it's like, wow, I have no freedom, but I'm better than I've ever been.
My gut feeling is that's a bad trade, but okay, I just read Invent and Wander by Bezos. Well, it's a compilation of Bezos's writing, and there's one speech or something in there where he says, I mean, of all people, he has this deep appreciation for the power of markets, and sort of won the game, but he basically just says they reward human agency. And he said, even if there was, and this was years ago, so it's sort of prophetic, but he said, even if there's some super intelligence, some AI that could perfectly sort all the goods and eliminate waste and say, we don't need that many chickens, like based on consumption patterns, we know exactly how many chickens to hatch, this year or whatever. He says, I still would reject that because it eliminates human agency. And there's such inherent good in human agency to go make something out of nothing and go take a bet on yourself. And obviously I resonate with that, given, what I work on, and I'm sure you resonate with that as well. And so, it sort of seems like a bad trade. The thing that I come back to sometimes that is the ultimate, like, throw my hands up and I don't know, is when you start making these sweeping historical comparisons, like something like the invention of writing, or my God, even the invention of language itself. Like, this emergent intelligence is arguably on par with that. Okay. Like, we can't even, I mean, people toss around the printing press all the time, right? And that was tremendously, to say the least, impactful, and leads to things like the 30 Years' War, the invention of the nation state, or the emergence of the nation state. That's a pretty big one. But the emergence of language itself, and I don't know the exact year, it's somewhere in the, tens of thousands to maybe 100,000 years ago, language like emerges, and the entire conception of the way the world appears to you shifts. And so if it's that big of a shift, like these debates that we're having over how it's going to affect the 2024 election, or how it would affect entrepreneurship, it just leaves all that in the dust. You know what I mean? And so it's just, and in the past, I remember hearing Naval like 5 or 6 years ago on a podcast being like, I think AGI might be 100 years out. I think that was like a knowledge project with Shane Parrish or something. And now it seems kind of naive to have that opinion, obviously. And so do you see what I'm saying? Like, if it's actually that degree of change, which is super extreme, it's all speculative, but it's a lot of these conversations are almost rendered kind of irrelevant. You know what I mean? It's just,
I think there's, I have two, sorry.
Go for it.
Yeah, so kind of two things. One is like the words we use are really important. And like AGI is such a fuzzy thing. And I really experienced this in virtual reality. So back in 2014, 2015, I started a VR company when it was even less of a thing than it is today. And I'm hundreds to thousands of people, I'm putting them into headsets, and no one has a shared language into what a virtual reality experience is. And a $5,000 HTC Vive experience compared to a $5 Google Cardboard experience in your mobile phone, those are both equally virtual reality. And you'll try just that one thing and it equates to the whole paradigm. With AGI, arguably, we have a form of AGI today. Like the fact that we now have a multimodal thing that can see your shirt and understand irony, like that is a form of general intelligence separate from specialized intelligence. Like Google Maps has been around for over a decade. So it's almost like we have the foundations of an AGI. And I think that is not like an inherently bad thing, because you can still have a contained AGI that is a consumer product, which is what OpenAI is trying to do. But I think the big risk is this kind of like takeoff where you have some either a super intelligence that has its own goals and becomes as powerful as its own company, or if you have some person with bad incentives who has a powerful open like an open source LLM, and they unleash some monster. You know what I mean? So there's kind of that whole spectrum of AGI.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, right. That's a great way to put it. I think we do have some form of it already. That's totally true. I mean, it's so funny. Like everybody talks about like goalpost moving, but like, good Lord, like even 2 years ago, if you'd said it, understood the irony of a sweatshirt I was wearing, it would be floored. I'm still floored. Like I'm floored.
Yeah.
I was seeing that yesterday. So I think that's a great point. I guess the other one too, there's different things working in concert here. It's not like there's the AGI itself, but then obviously you look at like a Neuralink, like, brain computer interface type stuff. That by the way, that might be even more so the thing that's like a shift as dramatic as like the invention of language or something, right? Like where, I mean, Elon Musk has these quotes saying, hey, in a decade, you'll be able to communicate without language or something, right? Like now he tends to be aggressive on his timescales, but like if that's true in any sort of sense, again, that's just like a potentially really destabilizing change. It's hard to talk about because we just don't know. But here's one to get a bit more practical. I'm curious how you think about this, because when I turned 30 2 months ago, I set out like these very concrete goals, and 3 of them that I'll just share are sort of more like professionally oriented. Was like I want Rite of Passage by the time I'm 40. I want Rite of Passage to be tremendously successful, hit a certain revenue number, have a certain impact on the world. I want to have at least 100,000 followers, 6 figures of followers with my writing. I want to publish 5 books by the time I'm 40. And I want to have this Chinese media empire, I call it, this company I founded about me speaking Chinese, exploring my favorite topics. I want to have a physical office. So these seemed like just such motivating goals. And the 2 months after that, I was just like locked in and just going so hard on Chinese, so hard on Rite of Passage, thrilled about these goals. And even the last couple of weeks, I mean, I love Chinese. I'm not going to stop studying it. But the fact that there's a guy on Twitter who's speaking perfect Mandarin, like I'm going to notice that, he's never studied a day in his life. And, the stuff, the GPT and all, it just makes me breathe. Like, how do you even have a 10-year goal? Or like, so I guess it's 2 things. One, how are you thinking about like taking advantage of these things? Because there's wide open opportunity, obviously, if you can understand this stuff and take advantage of it. But then doesn't it destabilize any type of long-term planning or thinking you do? Because the ground is shifting so quickly.
Totally. I think by 2029, you'll be able to, within a day, generate 5 books that are better than you could personally write yourself. And like to make that even more extreme, like I think by 2029, in just that 1 year, a single person will be able to generate 37 million new Beatles songs that are phenomenal. It's just like it's this kind of sense of the impossible.
By 2029.
Yeah, that's kind of.
This is why I'm glad we're talking, because I know how exponentials work, sort of like we're not wired biologically to understand exponentials, but I know it's startling, like how things actually move when they're actually exponential. But like even that, like I think thinking about the next 10 years different than like the average person who's basically viewing it linearly. Oh, the iPhone's getting really good. Like maybe I'll have a little VR thing in 2029. The things you're saying are categorically, cataclysmically different.
Yeah.
And that's only 6 years, by the way. And so It's like, it takes a tremendous amount of mental flexibility, almost the opposite of just like mental inertia, blind mental inertia, to like even acknowledge that that might happen, and then to even think about what that could mean for society at large or yourself specifically. And so if you think that's true, and I know you're a guy who loves writing and loves music, and what you're describing is unthinkable to basically everybody alive today. And the stuff we already have is disorienting. That is beyond disorienting. Like it's disorienting for me. How are you living your life in a way that reflects this fact? To take
Yeah. So one thing is, I think my logging practice is very much in line with what I think will be important in the future. And so just for some context, it's like, in addition to writing essays, which I write weekly or monthly, I upload around between 5 and 50 thoughts per day on my website. And they're not tweets, they're not public, but I have in public just like a full record of my important moments from my day that I think are worth writing.
Nuances of your unique brain. Yeah, right.
Right. And so like by 2029, I'll have probably 1 million to 2 million words of original text that I have at my disposal. And so if you and me and everyone else are trying to create a, you know, an agent that closely resembles how we think, like I'm gonna have 2 million words, the average person might just have some emails, like they might have 10,000 words. They're not even important. Like it doesn't cover the full range of themselves. So it's like, I'm trying to render my whole self in text. And that's like one part of it. That's like the unconscious of an agent in the future. In addition to that, what I'm trying to do is develop a symbolic theory on what makes a good essay, what makes a good song, right? Because like, for example, right now, OpenAI is really just an LLM. And what I think is preventing it to have this takeoff intelligence is symbolic logic on top of it, a theory on what consciousness is that the LLM like bubbles up into. And so my 2 million words of logs is going to be the subconscious brain. And then I will have a symbolic, imagine just like 200 lines of code on my slant on what I think a good essay is, you know? And you'll be able to fuse that rational and the irrational into some agent that could produce 1,000 essays every single day, you know? And what that means is that you as a person, you can just be like, hey, here's what I'm thinking today. Let me just write 20 words into my phone. And by you writing that, you can then just get an essay from me. And it'll be however long you want. How much time do you have to read? Do you have 3 minutes or do you have 3 hours? So you just write in a thought how long you want to read for. And now you have a full tour through how I would think this through.
It's absolutely fascinating. I know you're passionate about the logs, but I never viewed it in this context. And then, and not to mention essay structures. So it's almost like that's the supply side. So, I mean, there's so much to be said on that. It's really, really interesting. And I feel like we could explore that through many conversations, but just to go broad for a second, that's like the supply side, if you will, like that's like you are creating this like supply of ideas into the world. And you're positioning yourself such that you're going proverbially to where the puck will be, not where the puck is, in a very dramatic way, in a way that most people don't have the foresight to do. And so if the puck doesn't in fact get there by 2029 or somewhere around there, and you have this thing, and you have this, we talk about rite of passage, write the essay only you can write. Well, it's that on, you know, steroids and then some. So you have that in 2029. Let's just play this out. And you can generate, you know, whatever, 1,000 essays a day or what have you, or like any person can go to you, the Michael Dean agent that is one of one singular, because you have 2 million words behind it, and get your thoughts on anything. And it just, God knows like the implications of that. But like, how do people even have the bandwidth to process all that information? I'm sure it's something related to AI as well, but like, right, just the sheer volume of information being produced, like how do people receive that in any way that's meaningful for them? And I see a little glint in your eye, so I know you've thought about this.
Yeah, it's I had a good word for this, but it's not coming to me. But the whole idea is that we're about to enter this range of content where there'll be a vast underworld where there will be like millions or billion times more music generated that's possible to listen to. And so like the way I think of it is like in the future, every single Beatles song will have its own infinite radio. So you'll have like Here Comes the Sun just continuously riffing 24/7. You already have this. There's already an infinite radio that's been going 18 months just generating funk. And so the idea is like there's just going to be a lot of stuff where it's always generating and no one's going to hear it and it's just going to evaporate, you know?
Right. So, right.
So it's not like there's going to be there's not like, there won't really be a definitive catalog of Michael Dean essays or Beatles songs or anything. It's all going to be like, hey, as a consumer, you have a certain impulse and you're met with the intelligence of an agent. And I think like that ranges from really interesting to really kind of dangerous. But I think in the interesting case, it's like, oh, I can write, I can upload my journals and for the week, and it'll actually generate a Beatles album in the style of Sgt. Pepper's, direct with the lyrics based on my life and the characters of my life. Well, that's kind of cool, There's also this really negative side where it's like social media just turns into a custom generated hallucination where it's not about sharing or connecting. It's like, yeah, we can put you in a potent hallucination with everything that you want. You never have to leave it.
Yeah. That's
it's like everyone has one-on-one.
The thing, because like there's still amidst all this, like what's the like inalterable, at least of now, like ground level truth, which is the biology, it's the biological hardware. There's just only so much music you listen to. There's only so many ideas. Like there's a rate limit of how much stuff your brain can process. Now, if you're talking about BCI, maybe that changes, but yeah, I do see. I mean, it's remarkable, obviously, and then it's the risk of like being being siloed or being just so pigeonholed in one thing. But it's also just like tremendously exciting. If I think with any of these, you have to acknowledge there's like just the bad actors thing, and like bad things can come from any of this, right? What is the internet increases variance? The good gets better, the bad gets worse. Okay, fine. So we just don't look at the bad stuff for now, because we're gonna have to figure that out as a human intelligence or other forms of intelligence to solve these problems. Okay, you have to just have some faith in that. But if you just consider the cool side of this for a moment, like I think of, like I like Emerson. There's no secret there, as do you, right? And like I've read a lot of his writing. I've got this big fat biography here, 500 pages that I've read of him. And like, I know that when I read his words, it stirs something in my soul that I almost can't articulate, or I need a lot of time to articulate. I haven't found the time in the last few years because I've been working, I've been busy. And there's just for this one thinker who lived 150 years ago, there's like an infinite wealth of his ideas. It's almost like he logged in a way. Well, and I mean, it wasn't literally what you're doing, but kind of, right? He printed millions of words of his thoughts onto the page, and everybody around him didn't. And everybody around him is totally dead in a way. And Emerson is still alive because we both have his ideas in our head, and we've discussed these before. And so, but it's very hard to access that. And then you can discover 50, 100 thinkers. Venkatesh Rao, I'm so floored by his mind and the things he's able to create, but I've only read maybe 3% of his writing, and I only retained maybe 1/10 of that. And it's so frustrating to know there's infinite richness surrounding me just in this realm of ideas, and I can't like get into it all. Does that make sense? Like it's like it's like these huge pools of water, and I have to drink them with a straw. And to me, that this does, it just creates like these like channels for all that water to flow and mix together, and then I can access the mix of it all together rather than having to go around to each separate bucket or pool or whatever and drink from the straw. Does that make sense? Like it like exponentially increases like quality of inputs that I can then drive into my hardware. So I can't increase the rate limit of what I can put in here, but the quality of it, I can get the best of Venkatesh, the best of Emerson, and then remix it all. And then that's the stuff I'm consuming. And that just puts me in a different stratosphere of ideas in my head versus.
Yeah, exactly. I think like the best case is like AI is a profound matchmaker that connects you with exactly the right people and exactly the right ideas. And that's like the best case of the internet now. And AI is going to do that even to an unimaginable degree. So to give an example, like Venkatesh Rao, I've read 2 or 3 of his essays. I'm like, wow, this is great. It's kind of dense, takes a lot to process, but he has like hundreds of these. And like,
no, like thousands and thousands. He's written millions of words. The guy's
So it would take me 2 weeks of my life to stop and catch up and manually read it all. And I probably wouldn't digest most of it. And like, we're entering a point where like end of this decade, if he wanted to, he could effectively create a synthetic version of his consciousness that's trained on all of his material. And I could pay $10 per session, and I could go and I can have an hour-long conversation with him. And so anybody can do that. And so similar, like you and I right now, we each have a vast interior, but through conversation, we're finding the shared ground. So by having Synthetic Venkatesh Rao, now him and I can have this relationship. And from my perspective, I can get what I want out of him. And his agent can be like, whoa, check out this Michael Dean. You guys have a lot of overlap compared to your other 30 conversations. So like there's a world in which AI becomes so good, and this isn't generative AI, this is a slightly different kind, where it's more about semantic matching. But you can imagine if everyone in the world was just logging all of their thoughts, it would be able to connect people to an uncanny degree, to the point where it would feel almost religious, where it's like, wow, I've had a certain nature of connections in my life and I'm close to people. But now, like today, I just met like 5 people who I can consider to be like the closest friend I've ever met, and that could just happen every single day.
Really coming up for me is how similar this is. It's just a much more extreme, efficient version of what we preach in Rite of Passage, which is now you come into a pool of 400 people, and it's through conversation. It's not being augmented by AI, but people are so struck by like the quality of connections they're able to have just through that. And there's really, I think we all think Rite of Passage is such a humble beginning for what it could one day become. And we don't exactly know what it could become, but I view it as like this, imagine Rite of Passage is just like this seed of an oak tree, and like just the seed, or it's like a little sapling now. And people are so blown away by the internet to just connect them to more interesting people than they have, in their physical space, and people all over the world. Like people are just floored. And that's just a sampling of like 400 people who happen to follow, David on Twitter, or, be kicking around, the Twitter sphere or whatever. And so you see how that's like a sapling versus like the mighty oak tree you're describing of what this looks like when it's not just the internet as a matching tool, but AI as a matching tool. And it's not just your chat in a breakout or your post in Circle or your essay topic as a filter, but like your like absolutely unique one of one LLM that's generated based on, 500,000 or 1 million of your thoughts. Like I see it, dude. That's all I'm saying. Like, it's just, you see what I'm saying? Like I can see the A to Z.
Yeah. And what's really wild is if you go back to like the late 80s and early 90s, there's something called The Well. And it was one of the first like internet communities that had like a certain perspective on culture. And there's a great story from this guy, Howard Rheingold, and he's in Silicon Valley, and he goes into a house party in like the late 80s, and everyone's a stranger. He doesn't recognize anybody, but he had been talking with all of these people online before, and he knew the intimate details of all of them. And so even though it was a room full of strangers, he can go up to someone and say, oh, that's you. And then they would catch up. And then if you think about like now 30 years later, we have Rite of Passage meetups, and it's that same thing. Like, oh, we've never met, but we're totally up to speed. And so the scale of that went from 1,000 people in the late 80s to maybe now it's like 1 million people who are really utilizing the internet to meet others. And you can say like, maybe it's just going to take another 30 years to the point where, there'll be 1 billion people who will be putting some version of their thoughts online, and they will just have access to this like matchmaking that is obviously worth it.
It's just reframing. I mean, I'm tremendously excited about Rite of Passage, but it just amplifies the magnitude of the things we already believe about what Rite of Passage could be, or just more broadly what the internet can be. I mean, all Rite of Passage is just a layer on top of the internet that like harnesses it more effectively for specific ends that people want, right? And so whether that's sharing ideas or sort of in finding the opportunities or finding the others. And this is just like a super, super amplified version of that. And it's the opportunity is staggering. I whipped out my old, this was an absolute earthquake book from years ago. You've read this, right?
I'm actually re-listening to it now to refresh myself. Yeah.
I need to go thoroughly back through all of it, but there's these incredible lines in here, right? Like the marginal value generated by superior performance in global markets is tremendous. This line I used to always quote from here is merit in the internet age, merit will be rewarded like never before. Here's another one. The rewards for rare skills have increased and are only increasing. And so like, I've always thought about that in the context of like, okay, like a Sahil Bloom type guy on Twitter, he's making 7 figures. I mean, he's a smart guy, don't get me wrong, but like Emerson, I think, is one of the most unique minds of the last 200 years. And we talked about this last time, he was poor all his life because he was just didn't even have a microphone, much less the internet, right? And so Sahil Bloom, living 100 years ago, is like doing pretty well, like in his town, probably, like the equivalent guy. In this day and age, he's making 7 figures, but like, it doesn't stop here. Like, it's only the returns for skill and ability are only more extreme going forward. I think that can be viewed individually, but also like it's like as an institution or as a company. So I don't know. I'm just saying, like, rite of passage, that idea applied to rite of passage, for example, if rite of passage can do something and basically in a very skillful way, the returns to that are maybe 1,000x what would have been in the past. Don't, I mean, in this,
compared to like a little writing school in Austin 20 years ago.
8 years ago. Yeah, right,
Yeah.
right. So it seems to present just these incredible opportunities. Like, there's so much. Do you think of it? So you're thinking of it in terms of vlogging and in terms of your ideas, and that's really, really interesting. How do you think of it in terms of entrepreneurship? I'm sure you've got ideas cooking and whatever you want to share. I don't know if you want to share everything or what, but like, I mean, there's going to be companies that just like what I was just describing. There's going to be companies that just harness this, and not just the ones actually building the systems, but the application layer on top of the systems. You mentioned before, like the interface.
Yeah.
Needs to grow, but there's different types of interface. There's the tech interface, but then like rite of passage is like a social interface on the internet, right? And what else is it? That's exactly what it is. And so like how do you think of this in terms of entrepreneurship?
Yeah, it's good to kind of separate the personal and the collective, right? Like, and yeah, I think like the way that we've continuously iterated on the curriculum and the editor program, like the whole spirit of how rite of passage develops, it stays modern with what's possible versus like, oh, we're just going to kind of clone this thing. It's actually a lot of friction to continuously update for the cutting edge, and some people just don't even think it's worth doing. Something that I've been trying to do is learn to code.
Right.
I've done a little bit of coding in the past, usually for very specific cases. I can't say I'm like a coder, but AI, like GPT-4, just really lowers the barrier to the point where I've been building just like little apps for myself. So I think like learning the basics of code and just like building tools for yourself is a great start. And so I have the basics of a text editor now where I can write, and at the end of every sentence, it analyzes that sentence to my body of logs and then pulls up the logs that are most relevant. So I'm getting my notes as I write without having to search.
That's incredible.
Proactive. That's like thinking about the infrastructure that like basically social media. Like, I think that seems like a really broken space right now, and everyone feels like we need to change. Which is kind of cool. This is another example of internet serendipity. So I wrote an article, like, here's what's wrong with social media, here's how to fix it. I posted it online, and then like a few weeks later, someone comments like, hey, like, I founded a company and we're trying to solve this exact thing. Turns out the guy's in New York. So I'm like, oh, let me stop by. So in the last few weeks, I've went there 3 times, and we're just chatting about like the design of social networks. But now that we have AI, how can we do it differently? Like 15 years ago, we had to build feeds because that's the best way to connect people. But now that you have embeddings and you can telepathically connect people, how can you build a network where 99% of the people share instead of only 1%?
Man, well, like you said, now the feed, what the AI has done to the feed is just make it more addictive and more extractive, right? This was TikTok, and now Twitter's For You feed is like this too, right? Like it's exacerbated an already unhealthy model. I would argue. I mean, some would say you're getting more content delivered to you that's relevant. Yes, but it's also more addictive, right? Like, if I had Twitter even 3 years ago, I was seeing the people I follow, and it was like pretty good. It was pretty addictive. If I go on the Twitter For You feed, I don't know how other people. Maybe I just tend to be slightly more addictive personality, but like every tweet is so interesting. It's so rich. I can't handle it. Like I block it on my phone. I'm probably going to reblock it on my computer. I just lose hours because it's so interesting. Does that make sense? And so it's like, it's just more addictive and more extractive. So yeah, I think you have to rethink the whole model somehow. And that's interesting that you're exploring that right now. Yeah.
Yeah. And so this company's philosophy, they're called Plexus. And the whole thing is like, there is no feed when you sign in. and you have to post in order to unlock the network. And so the idea is that, like, you can only participate by sharing. So you can't just binge, you have to share something. And then once you make that post, it uses that post and it constructs a whole feed around it. You know what I mean? And there's just so many little things you can make. Like in the latest version that I was trying, that came out yesterday, you make your post, it generates the feed, and it doesn't tell you who's posting what. It's all anonymous. And only if I like it or connect with it does it reveal who it is. And then it sets up an email between us so we can talk. And it's just like, yeah, like we have the technology now to totally reimagine how social connection works. And we could be in a world where it's like you could be sharing your most intimate truths on social media, but no one is ever going to see it unless they also share something of that nature, and then it connects you.
Fascinating. It
Yeah.
really aligns a lot of incentives that aren't aligned right now at all.
Yeah.
Because you're skin in the game too, by the way. If you're, you know, if you're actually sharing, I guess there's a thing about, is it you or is it a pseudonym? But it's a separate question. Yeah, it's just with all this stuff, it's so hard to go back in hindsight. And like, I was, you know, again, reading Bezos's early shareholder letters, and like in hindsight, it's like, oh my gosh, like Amazon was just a slam dunk. Like, you know, how were people not just gobbling up the stock, you know, 1998 or whatever. But it wasn't like that in the time, you know, probably people thought pets.com was going to be the big thing, and Amazon
Right.
was too scattered, and right, like whatever, like, and so like, how do you, it's such a seductive thing to try to find the next Sergey and Larry, find the next Bezos. I mean, these guys are already out there, like kicking around projects exactly like you're describing right now. And just, I mean, I guess one would be Sam Altman, but like, other than that, like, I guess you're already doing it by just finding people who are building things that resonate with you. But like, I'm sure, who wouldn't want to find those projects in their early stages and kind of latch onto them and get involved with them? So any other thoughts on how you're doing that other than what you just described?
No, I think those are kind of the big three. It's like building a body of work, like actually creating, then like learning how to build in these new layers, and then kind of finding others who express that same like openness to the future
Really good.
instead of skepticism.
Yeah.
And I'll say one more thing, because you know, I started a VR company in 2015, and it was like just too early. You know, everyone was blown away by it, but you know, real estate agents and architects, developers, it was too clunky to adopt into their workflow. With Vision Pro coming out next year, I mean, it's still clunky. It's still a long way to go where everyone needs one, right? But I plan to get one, right? And like, that's a very different stance than someone who just like makes fun of that, memes it, says it's stupid, and like, hell, I want to like learn to develop on that, you know?
Right.
And so it's kind of like a willingness to kind of like speak out and support technologies that others are going to laugh at, and for you to be like, yeah, I think this is cool, I'm going to build on it, and you'll see.
Yeah.
You know?
Totally. It's like a, you know, probably most people, if it was 1996 and you're like, hey, I bought something on the internet, and somebody's like, you use the information superhighway, you know, somebody's going to hack your credit. I don't know if they even knew the word hack, but somebody's going to steal your credit card. I mean, credit cards were, there was a thing going on Twitter a few weeks ago of like 1993, 30 years ago. As he was born, it wasn't that, you know, not that long ago, and Burger King had introduced credit cards. You see this video? And people were shocked that you could buy Burger King with a credit card. Like it was baffling. And then all these people are like, why would you ever want, because the idea of putting something on credit was if you're like buying a couch at Kmart and you'd like buy it on credit. And then you had this card that could buy stuff on credit. And they're like, why would you ever want a $5 burger? Why would you, or $3 burger, whatever? Why would you ever buy that on credit? People thought it was preposterous. Okay, so that's 93. 3 years later, people are then using this newfangled credit card to buy something on the information superhighway. So that's like, right? Because it's doubly weird. Like I didn't even know credit card was considered that weird back then. So then that really puts it in context. And so then like, yeah, dude, it's like the equivalent of like, I don't know, like AI, like real-time analysis of an image like GPT can do is weird. That's like your credit card. And then the hardware is weird. That's like buying something on the information superhighway. And to do those together in 1996 is just like radical. It's like just walk in the store and give the guy 20 like you're supposed to. You know what I mean? And so like you're stacking these multiple things and then just being willing to experiment with it. Because the guy who bought something on the guy who bought a book on Amazon.com in 1996, maybe he buys another and then another and is telling his friends, and his friends all think it's weird and they're busting his balls saying, oh, you're going to lose all your money. And then maybe he buys 10 shares of stock at, at $12 or something. And then buys, and then keeps buying over the next few years. And that guy's sitting on millions of dollars right now. It's just like, it's so intoxicating to try and find that. And so I obviously you can't know. And I think what you're saying is just to be in the space. The fact that you had those Ray-Ban glasses in January says a lot, right?
Mm-hmm.
The fact that you're thinking about these logs in a very sort of original way says a lot. Yeah, to get the Vision Pro, I think says a lot. I mean, it makes me want to, lean in a bit more too, and just dip the toes in a bit more. Because it's just massive opportunity, obviously. And if anything, even more so than the internet, because the stuff is going to happen faster. And the other thing that I always like this point is that just the sheer volume of people online. Let's reread that line for the sovereign individual. The marginal value generated by superior performance in global markets is huge. And now that was true in 1996, but the absolute size of the global market in 96 versus 2026, 30 years later, I mean, it is exponentially larger in 2026, right? Like how many people were online truly in 96 or even 2006? Like a pretty small fraction. I love the stat that in 2009, 5% of people in India were online. Okay, 2021, that number was 90%.
Wow.
So you had like many hundreds of millions of people come online. I think there's a stat I know there's a stat I heard recently in sub-Saharan Africa every day about 90,000 people come online. And it's not even 100,000 people. No, it's like, SoFi Stadium here in Los Angeles. I've seen that thing full, Rolling Stones concert. That many people in sub-Saharan Africa, just as one continent, every single day. And so these gaps it's just the sheer volume of people. And then if you throw in the translation stuff, like, I mean, people talk about like the world's first trillion and stuff. There's just like unbounded opportunity presented by these technologies you're describing. And it's so intoxicating to try to like.
It's so wild, both like the idea of being like a sole sovereign individual who's 5 years ahead of the curve, who like goes into a territory that's like one scale, and then it's like the stadium full of people, like mass adoption coming online, right? And I think like it is like the idea of living in the future. It's both kind of just like inherently interesting and satisfying. There's also a huge opportunity, both commercially and like culturally. And so it's like being that individual. If you're kind of willing to shape a weird path, like I think it'll be good for you generally. But to kind of like bring it back to the sovereign individual and like close it, as I'm like re-listening to it, I'm starting to think that like it only has half the picture. Like I think it kind of talks about these like, okay, the nation states kind of all crumble and dissolve, and then it's these like one-off, titans who come and they rule the world. And while that will be true, I think you'll also have new kinds of clusters of power that have unimaginable scale and power. You know what I mean? And so it's like, I don't really think it's like, oh, we're shifting back to individuals. I think it's just going to be a new type of tension,
Can I suggest one?
Yeah.
It might sound weird, but Mr. Beast. Let me, it sounds, this is just like a weird, seems like a rabbit hole. What am I saying? It's just like that guy has so much wattage of human attention directed at him. The things he can do with that. I've heard this guy, Justin Murphy, talk about this a couple years ago. Really, he told David, and David told me, but it was just this idea that like he eventually could like create some form of like sovereignty or some entity. It's almost, I don't even know exactly how it plays out, but he just has such an ungodly amount of human attention pointed at him and his fellow band of like buddies in North Carolina. And that's only going to keep increasing. And then you get this translation stuff. And like he'll get, one day he'll have 500 million followers. And then he's not going to stop. And he's like in his early 20s. Right. He's not going to, I mean, he might have 1 billion followers one day. And so like what happens when one, and I'm not saying it's all good, by the way, because I think there's this old Google thing, like, don't be evil. It was just like their tagline. But like there's a real depth to like the humanities and understandings of morality, and things are very subtle. And like, there's a great YouTube video recently mocking Mr. Beast, or sort of parodying Mr. Beast. It's on this channel, Pursuit of Wonder, but like what Mr. Beast taken to the nth degree looks like. There's all these people suffering. They have to like play these goofy games to like relieve their suffering. And there's sort of like a twisted side to it. So I'm not saying it's all good. I think him, Jimmy, Mr. Beast is like incredibly brilliant in some ways and probably like extremely, extremely naive in other ways. And so I'm not saying it's all good, but is that one form of what you mean when you say there's these different entities that have power? It's probably a bit of a far afield example, but like, does that land for you, or do you sort of mean something totally different?
Well, I think that idea is more in line of the sovereign individual, where Mr. Beast is the new cluster of power. I think two things will have, like 2 points here. One is that as he scales, there's only so much one person can do. And you can imagine in 50 years, Mr. Beast is a traditional media company. The ultimate irony. The other angle is that while Mr. Beast and other people will become these titans, right? Just imagine Meta. And once everyone is wearing these, there's AI in all of them, and it is real-time data on what everyone sees all day. It effectively can become this form of an all-knowing, omnipresent God, where it sees what everyone sees, and you can pray to it and ask it things, and it knows what you want. And like, there's just a certain there's certain like new frontiers of power that I don't think a Mr. Beast could ever capture. That you need to have control of the software and the hardware to actually really, more so the hardware really, to gain that power.
Well, that real quick, that's interesting you say that, because there was just a thing today about Sam Altman is they took a bunch of money from some investor, $1 billion to, or maybe more than that, to launch the iPhone of AI or something. Like OpenAI to answer the iPhone. And it was like interesting. It was like, why would they go for hardware? Isn't that notoriously difficult? Doesn't Apple just have this huge head start, and like it's so hard to build hardware, in the world of atoms, and like you're giving a pretty good reason as to why.
Yeah, and think of it, Apple was able to block Fortnite and Epic Games from coming onto their operating system. So if someone wants is like, hey, you Mr. Beast and this tribe of 50 rogue individuals, we're not going to let them be on our phones,
Yeah, is there anything else on that thought? We can maybe wrap, and we'll have a minute to debrief once we stop the recording. But
I can share just one kind of closing thought.
Please,
and it's like, I think it's a Carl Sagan quote where it's like, we have Neolithic emotions with medieval institutions on top of it building angelic technologies. And so it's really exciting to understand, like, as our technologies are actually approaching like magic levels, like the religious imagination of the past is now coming through in that Star Wars video that just came out. It's like, it's becoming impossible and like numinous, but I think it's important not to like just obsess over the technologies. I think the most important thing to do in this upcoming cycle of just radical insanity is to try and use the technologies to reform the institutions so that there's better incentives. Because most people aren't evil, but when you have bad incentives and bad structures, that's when things corrupt. When things corrupt with unlimited power, it starts to get very dangerous. So you want to basically design a new layer of institutions that can promote equality and to evolve the psyches of everyone underneath them. And I think like if you think about AI, VR, and crypto, they all have the potential to do that. It's just important to really have that like game B thinking in mind versus just like optimizing for your own gain.
Man, that's what got me into this, right? When I read Sovereign Individual Game B. Yeah, really well put. Really, really well put. And what's the name of that social media company you mentioned that's in New York, kind of redoing the Pixel something?
Plexus.
Plexus, great. Yeah, that's such a good example. And it's helpful to think in broader timescales, because it's like, Facebook, Meta, Google, Apple, they're these immovable titans. And it's like not true. Like they're in a certain time scale, they're just not. Like there's things just get disrupted, and things, think about how much Microsoft is doing well, like enterprise wise and stuff. But think about how much Microsoft missed the boat on like all things consumer. And in 1995, famously, there's this book, The Information Superhighway by Bill Gates. I read it once. He kind of misses a lot of stuff, and they didn't have the incentives to like follow a lot of the trends that these other companies did, right? Because they were incentivized for different things. They were incentivized for the personal computer, and they were sort of they're incentivized in some ways away from the information superhighway. And like a Facebook Meta or, you know, some of these platforms are incentivized away from doing the thing that is healthier because their business model is operates around like, no, it just, you know, being more extractive of the existing model.
Right.
So that's really interesting about Plexus. And it's funny we didn't mention that Star Wars video now. That was in some ways the most amazing one. This Charlie Chaplin style 1920s
That
film.
blew my mind. That was
Blew my
crazy.
mind. And I showed my friend that last night after I showed him GPT. I mentioned the language thing. He was really struck by the language thing, but the Star Wars one really floored him, and it did for me too. It stopped me.
Yeah.
I think I texted you immediately. My one quote I'll end on is just the future is disorder. A door like this is cracked open 5 or 6 times since we got up on our hind legs. It is the best possible time to be alive when almost everything you thought you knew is wrong. Tom Stoppard. So as exhilarating as this is, as sometimes disorienting as this is, it can present tremendous opportunities. So I want to keep having these conversations because I feel like most people aren't thinking at it this rigor in depth, really more so you than me, but it's great to kick around these ideas and just, it can't hurt to keep talking about this stuff and just be thinking about it and thinking in the time scales that you're thinking in and just imagining what's possible. So that's what really limits us really to imagine. Right. So yeah.
This was a lot of fun. And
Yeah.
even when you have a conversation like this, there are so many things that we bring up that we can't click into.
Yeah.
So I have a list of just like all the things that like we still have to unpack. So it's like every conversation can be, you know, generate the scope of the next one.
Amen. Yeah, I think so. All right. Round 1. We'll leave it there.
Yeah.
Michael, it's great. We'll do this again soon. So
Yeah, definitely.